So back to RMAC. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the State of California's Range Management Advisory Committee, this is a legislated organization that was implemented back in the late 60s, early 70s. And so it exists in the state of California as the only advisory body that deals with rangeland management in the state of California. So our responsibility is to monitor policies and programs and activities being performed by other state agencies and by other actors in the state of California that are having impacts, good or bad, on rangelands. We're particularly interested in regulatory processes that are being developed for rangelands, including water quality and wildlife habitat and a variety of other things. Also, land management. Right now, of course, one of the big topics in the state of California is wildfire and wildfire management. So one of the things that this particular committee did over the last 5 or 6 years is we realized that, so let's see, let me stop. Those of you who are in California may be familiar with the fact that CAL FIRE has long had a program called the Vegetation Management Program, the VMP. The VMP allowed the state of California to assist private landowners in managing fuels that were accumulating on their property. And they would actually allow CAL FIRE staff to conduct burns and to help in the planning and development of those burn practices. The VMP also allowed for other kinds of fuel treatment, so not just prescribed burns, but also mechanical treatment and such to manage the burns. However, grazing was never allowed under that program as one of the potential treatments could be used for managing wildland fuels. I think everyone seems to very well recognize that one of the issues we have in the state of California is the long-term and ongoing management of fuels in order to protect citizens and residents and properties. I'm an ecologist, an ecosystem scientist here at Cal Poly in the animal science department. My specialty area is rangeland management. I work with ranching and cattle and sheep operations and goats, but I also do a lot of wildlife work. And so in our group, we have been working on trying to find some ways to make grazing, which has been historically a land use practice that's been recognized for generations as being helpful for managing some kinds of wildland fuels. And so we labored for some years to get this brought into the system so that within the last, 2 years, that has been approved as one of the list of practices that can be applied for fuels management treatments. Right. So anyway, this is once we got that added in, our desire was to elevate grazing as being one, not the only, not the best, but one tool that had some value in treating landscapes and protecting against wildfire. So last year, our committee held our first public workshop to inform the public about opportunities for using grazing. And there's been a lot of interest. I know that the California Farm Bureau Association, the California Cattlemen's Association, the University of California Cooperative Extension Service have all been doing series of workshops on this particular topic. So our role is not to be the lead in doing the science or doing the public education, but our role is to try to stimulate public interest and public awareness of different topics that have to do with the stewardship and management of rangeland environments. That includes brushlands and grasslands in California. So this is a continuing series where we're working together with Extension and the Cattlemen's Association, Farm Bureau, in trying to continue rolling this ball along and providing public information education. So in this series of workshops, you're going to get to meet staff from CAL FIRE, from Cooperative Extension, some members of the Cattlemen's Association, and other people from other organizations that are all playing a role in this. We are aware that the California Fire Safe Council Association and many other organizations all are aware of fuel management issues. Many of them have some experience and practice in doing fuels management, including with grazing. And we want to make this a forum where we can spread the word and help other people become more engaged in the fuels management practice and process. So that's my introduction. So today's session, so each one of these 3 weeks that we're going to do has a particular focus of interest. So this week, we're inviting in folks from CAL FIRE and county fire associations who are doing work in dealing with fuels and managing fuels. So if you are not aware, CAL FIRE not only gets involved in putting fires out, CAL FIRE is also extremely involved in planning for the protection management of communities from fires. They're very interested in fuel loading and fuel management. So we have some of their staff and others who are with us who've got expertise in that background. There are also county and city level fire staff, fire professionals who are also involved in doing the planning work and understanding how these fuels are managed and looking for opportunities to manage them in their own districts. And so again, so this point today is to talk about fuels in particular. We want to acquaint you with the terminology, the history, the science, the background of what fuels are, what kinds of fuels are there out there, how are those different sorts of fuels managed, and how do fire professionals approach those fuels and developing plans for protecting communities and protecting the ecosystems that those fuels occur in. So I think this will be a great program. We want your interactions. This is not intended to be a one-way street. So I know the webinar is a little bit clunky that way. We can't open it up full force, but with over 200 people on the webinar, it's going to be difficult to manage all the interactions. So please post. Another thing I want you to know is Cal Poly is hosting this webinar because Cal Poly, unlike the state of California, has an easier time of recording these. So our desire, the committee wanted to have this program, but then record it so that we could post it where the other public could find it and other people could use this going forward. So all of these sessions will be recorded. Your notes, your comments will also be recorded as part of that. So bear that in mind as we're going along. So please ask questions, please interact, and please participate. And we're very glad that you've all been able to join us today. With that, I'm going to flip it over to my staff crew. Have I missed anything that we should touch on before we roll ahead?
I think we're good. Yeah, I'll just reiterate too that if anyone joined late and you have any questions, like even technical questions, feel free to use the Q&A and we'll touch in with you privately. So I think we just need to let John share his screen. I see there's a quick question in the chat while we're doing this. So the map that we were sharing just showed the California Fire Science Consortium, but we're one of 15 organizations that does fire science outreach. So we just have a sister organization that does the Great Basin fire science issues. So that's why that little chunk of California wasn't included in that. Still very important. We just know there's a lot going on, so we divided and conquered.
Actually, you know what? We've got just a minute or two. Stacy, so you're representing the California Fire Science Consortium. For the benefit of the public who is here, can you tell us just a little bit of background about the Fire Science Consortium and what that is and what that does?
Absolutely. So we are, like I mentioned, we're one of 15 fire science exchange networks. So basically, we are a federally funded program that tries to connect all these different fire issues in science and management on the ground, just trying to kind of facilitate information flow and networking and sharing. So we've been around for 10 years. Actually, this is our 10-year anniversary. And so we do everything from helping host webinars and technical issues. And non-COVID times, we do a lot of field trips and in-person workshops. We really feel that getting people in the room and being able to talk to each other about their science needs and their management needs is really important. And then we do also some more passive things like take journal articles and write research briefs on them or do syntheses of certain topics. So we're kind of that outreach facilitation side for all things fire science. And we're really excited to be here today because, especially for my organization in California, range is such an important part of all of this. It's such a complex topic, and fire is also so integral. And so we're really excited to try and work and see where we can find ways to integrate fire science and range management issues and hopefully work towards a different future with fire in California.
Rob, are you ready to go?
Yes, I'm ready to go.
Excellent. So, folks,
it's actually just in 2 simultaneous Zoom meetings, and so I'm going to be doing this on a much smaller laptop, but I think it'll work. And I was trying to bug out of a Fire Safe Council meeting.
That's completely fine. So take whatever time you need to get that done, and then we're ready for you when you're ready.
I'm good.
Okay. All right. So, folks, I would like to introduce to you our first speaker today. This is Rob Hazard. Rob, you're with the Santa Barbara County Fire, correct?
Correct.
Yes. Thank you very much. So Rob's done a lot of work in Santa Barbara County with the fuels and fire management. And so we asked him to give us an introduction, kind of a primer on fuels and a firefighter's perspective, a fire professional's perspective on the fuels and fuel management. So with that, I'm going to drop out, and Rob, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm excited to be here. And as Mark said, I work for Santa Barbara County Fire Department. I actually started 32 years ago in the U.S. Forest Service and worked on a local hotshot crew here in Santa Barbara. I thought I'd wind up retiring as a smoke jumper somewhere, but then 10 years later, I got hired by the county, and now I'm the fire marshal. So definitely a different future than what I originally envisioned when I was running a chainsaw on the hotshot crew. But I've been involved with wildland fire for all 32 years of my career. It's what I enjoy doing and feel the most comfortable doing. So I'm gonna start a PowerPoint here. Okay, so I'm gonna give basically a very basic primer on wildland fire behavior and then focusing on fuels. So for some people, this will be review. For some people, this will be new material. This is full disclaimer. I'm using some slides out of the National Wildfire Coordinating Group basic fire behavior class that we give to first-year firefighters. So moving forward. So when we talk about wildland fire, the key concept is fire behavior. Fire behavior is how we define the way a fire burns, its rate of spread, how fast it's burning, its intensity, how high the flame lengths are, the duration of fire on the landscape. All of these factors define the way a fire burns, in other words, its behavior. And some basic fire behavior terminology that wildland firefighters use, terms that basically describe that fire behavior. We talk about smoldering, which is basically fire burning in ground fuels like leaf litter. We see when the fire begins to become a little bit more intense and it starts burning through surface fuels like grass and pine needles and actually has some flaming component to it. And we call that creeping. As we get more intense fire and we start to burn into the canopy of vegetation, we call that running fire. When we see fire that sends out embers and the embers fall out ahead of the main flaming front of the wildland fire, we call that spotting. And that's a situation that causes great consternation for wildland firefighters is spotting. Torching is when we see individual trees or a small patch of a brush type fuel that ground fire moves into the canopy and basically torches out that one tree or bush. Flare-ups are where we have an increase in intensity along our fire line. Fire whirls, basically where we have a vortex that occurs along the flaming front. Smoke column pulls in flaming debris and fire itself, and basically is like a small little mini fire tornado. And over the last couple of years, with the increase in intensities we've seen on a lot of our fires, we actually are seeing some of these fire whirls that weather forecasters are looking at and saying, hey, those meet the definition of a tornado. Backing fire describes when a fire is burning against the wind or down a slope, where it's basically burning against the alignment of various factors that are influencing its spread. So backing fire is typically a situation that wildland firefighters use to their advantage because you have less intensity and a slower moving fire when it's backing. The flaming front defines the perimeter of the fire where all of the combustion is taking place. It's where we have our highest flame lengths and our most heat. And then crowning, of course, this is where we see sustained fire runs through chaparral or timber stands, very large flames. This is where we typically have very little suppression alternatives available to us other than using aerial resources such as air tankers. So again, fire behavior is defined by three factors. There's the weather factors that influence it. There's the topography, which is the shape of the land that the fire is burning in. And then our fuel bed, the vegetation that the fire is actually burning. Weather, topography, and fuel make up what we call the fire behavior triangle. And every action or every change in the fire's behavior can be attributed to these three factors and how they interact. The components of the wildland fire environment, the environment that the fire is burning in, made up of that fire behavior triangle. When we look at weather, that's typically the most dynamic factor and of the most concern to wildland firefighters are those various components of weather, which are made up by temperature, relative humidity, atmospheric stability, wind speed and direction, and precipitation. Topography is kind of the canvas that the fire is burning on. It's defined by the elevation where the fire is burning, the position on the slope, the aspect, in other words, what direction that slope faces, north, south, east, or west, because it has a great influence on the type of vegetation that grows. The shape of the country, the steepness of the slope. And so typically, we see our wildland fires much more difficult to control when they're in topography that contains mountains, saddles, passes, various types of terrain that typically would be difficult to create roads through and difficult to traverse even on foot. That type of topography becomes very conducive to rapid fire spread. Fire wants to burn uphill, all things being equal. And then fuels. Fuels are the vegetation that covers the landscape that typically, especially in the Western United States, have some component of them that is flammable. And those characteristics that define the fuel and how it burns are fairly well articulated and studied. And wildland firefighters use these characteristics to make predictions out in the field when they're determining strategy and tactics of how to deal with a wildland fire. And these characteristics are fuel loading, the size and shape, the compactness, the horizontal continuity, the vertical continuity, and the chemical content. So what is fuel? It's everything that can burn. Vegetation, whether it's living vegetation or dead vegetation, fuel that's lying on the ground, on the surface, fuel that's in the canopy of chaparral, brush, and timber. And it's also the built environment, homes, fences, things like that. So the first characteristic that we look at is defining the fuel type. What type is the fuel? And we simplify it, although there are hundreds of different kinds of vegetation out there, and every vegetation type can be further defined by its species. For wildland firefighters, we try to make it as simple as we can, and we define it by 6 different fuel types. And these are grass shrub, timber litter, timber understory, and slash or blowdown. And grass fuel types are one of the most common fuel types in California and across the Western United States. Fires tend to burn very quickly through grass, but our intensities are a lot lower. So in many cases, a lot of our fuel reduction efforts end up resulting in areas of grass. And there are challenges with the grass fuel type. It's very receptive to embers. Fire moves very, very quickly through it. It has an advantage that if properly maintained, whether through grazing or through mechanical means, mowing, weed whacking, that you can modify grass fairly easily from something that's very flammable and fire moves quickly through to something that actually is a barrier to fire, like a grazed field or a roadside where you mow the grass down real short. Shrubs, moving up a little bit in volume of fuel. Shrubs are defined as our brushy fuel types, particularly in Southern California, where we see chaparral predominant on the landscape. And fire burns with high intensity through our shrub fuels, particularly as they seasonally dry out throughout the year. An advantage to shrub fuels is they're not as conducive to ignitions, so it's a little bit harder to get them to ignite. Typically, the ignitions that we see are usually going to happen in a grass fuel type and then transition into your shrub fuels. The downside of the shrub vegetation is once fire does get burning in in chaparral field types particularly, is that we get very high intensity fire. Grass shrub is, this is probably one of the most common field beds we see across California in particular, where you have kind of a mix of shrubs and grass. This is a pretty volatile combination. The grass ignites easily and spreads fire quickly into the shrub field type, which then burns with much higher intensity. And timber litter is defined by the leaves, pine needles, duff, small branches that litter are mostly our conifer forests, the forest floor, but we see this in our hardwood forests also. And then the understory of our timber forests, typically smaller trees, patches of chaparral, those lower, not quite as tall field and vegetation that exists underneath the forest canopy, which can oftentimes transport fire into the canopy of the timber. Slash blowdown is another situation we see, whether it's through logging operations where there's a lot of slash left over, or just in our natural forest environment where there's just a large amount of dead trees that have fallen over the years and littered the forest floor. And then artificial fuels, and also this can be termed the built environment. And so this is everything that humans make that is mixed in with the wildland fuels that can become fuel to the fire itself. And clearly, obviously in California, the wildland urban interface is a large component of that. And what we're seeing in the last decade is quite a bit of fuel that's been involved in our fires that's human made. So another concept that's very important to wildland firefighters is the availability of the vegetation or the fuel to actually support combustion. So a good way of thinking of this is that in California, with our very, very large areas of rangeland, that fuel has a seasonal availability. So when those annual grasses germinate and grow, and in April and March and April, the landscape looks like Ireland. It's so green, all the hills are green. That vegetation is not available to burn. It's literally fireproof. But that very same vegetation in June, July, and August, when it's cured out, becomes very combustible. And so we consider it to be 100% available. And we see this same characteristic with our chaparral, brush field types, and even with our timber field types. So it's just a very important concept for wildland firefighters to understand what is it actually available to burn. Some characteristics of our fuels: fuel loading, the amount of fuel present, chemical content. This is volatile compounds that are created by the vegetation for various reasons, typically to make the vegetation more drought tolerant, like insulating the leaves from dry relative humidities and hot temperatures. Our fuel arrangement, how the vegetation is arranged across the landscape, the moisture content of that vegetation, and the size and shape of the vegetation. So when we look at fuel loading, it's the amount of fuel in a given area. It's expressed in tons per acre, and it's the dry weight of the vegetation, because that's the available portion that we're concerned with, is the dry weight of the vegetation. The chemical content is a huge factor in availability of fuel. So we see this with conifers like pines, where very flammable resins that are present in the actual in the actual trees can contribute hugely to the intensity of fire burning through pine stands. We see this with chaparral, waxy coverings over the leaves that make the vegetation very drought tolerant, but also make it very flammable. The arrangement. So this has a huge impact on how a fire burns. We look at the horizontal arrangement of the fuel and we define it as either continuous or patchy fuel. And so looking at that picture of the grass field on the left side of the screen, that it would be considered a continuous fuel bed. And when fire burns through that type of a fuel arrangement, there's going to be a very consistent spread of fire and a very consistent flaming front, and typically more intensity and typically a faster rate of spread. When we see patchy fields, a really good example of an environment where you see very patchy fields would be, you know, some of our desert areas where you might have, small shrubs that are isolated by large patches of ground that are devoid of vegetation, and fire spread, you know, much slower through those types of environments. And vertical arrangement defines, you know, how the vegetation is arranged vertically in terms of, do we see a canopy with a lot of fuel on the surface that allows fire to spread into that canopy, or do we have a separation from the surface fuels to the aerial fuels? Uniform fuels, this is a good picture defining that. So where we see a very uniform condition where the vegetation stays relatively the same. So, you know, if it's grass, we would just see a very large landscape of continuous grass, very uniform, or in some cases, we have the opposite, where we have grass field types in the foothills that then transition into chaparral fields in higher elevations. Again, here's a good picture of a patchy field condition. And some terms that we use to define the vertical fuel arrangement, and this is very important for wildland firefighters, and some of our tactics are based on these conditions. So our ground fuels, typically fire spreads through ground fuels. If you don't separate that ground fuel from the fire's edge, you can have fire spread very slowly, but spread across your containment line. So it really defines our basic tactics of wildland firefighting, is separating those ground fuels. Surface fuels are where we see the flaming front along the surface through grass or small shrubbery. Those aerial fuels are the canopies. And then the ladder fuels, this is a term used quite frequently. Ladder fuels are any kind of surface fuel that allows the fire to spread up into the canopy of our forest fuels. Ground fuels, again, comprised of deep duff, roots, rotten buried logs, peat, other organic material. Many hours and thousands of hours of a wildland firefighter's career are spent digging line through ground fuels. And some examples of surface fuels. Our ladder fuels is a great shot showing how fire can burn through the shrubbery and get into the canopy of our tree species. And then our aerial fuels are the upper portion of our trees. And you know, a strategy of vegetation management is to eliminate ladder fuels. We emphasize this when we're you know, giving guidance for homeowners for defensible space, and then within our vegetation management projects up and down the state. A major strategy is to often deal with those ladder fuels. You can leave the canopies of our trees, but try to thin out those ladder fuels that allow fire into the canopy. Moisture content is an extremely important concept for wildland firefighters. It defines the amount of water in our fuel, and this really is key to determining the availability of our fuels for combustion. And this is a great shot showing how you can see that the vegetation, just by its greenness, clearly has some variation in its fuel moisture content within this valley. We see this with our seasonal curing of our grasses as they become drier and drier, and that fuel moisture content lowers. We see this with our chaparral species, where they reach a peak of fuel moisture in our spring and then become extremely critically dry in the fall. And then size and shape. We define that our fuels by their size and shape. And we'll go around these screens. So 0 to 1/4 inch in diameter, these are our fine fuels. This is our grasses, pine needles, very small in their volume with a larger proportion of surface area, allows, as they burn, more oxygen to feed their fire. And you get very rapid rate of spread, but you get a less intense fire. And then as we move into larger diameter fuels, we see slower rates of spread with our fire, but more intensity. the size of the fuel also affects how much time it takes for the fuels to dry out, particularly the dead fuels. So dead fuels are kind of like a sponge. They'll absorb moisture, whether it's precipitation or even relative humidity, changes in your relative humidity. And so we see that our small diameter fuels react very quickly within hours to changes in atmospheric moisture content, whereas our larger diameter fuels take many, many days, if not weeks, to equalize with the atmospheric moisture or relative humidity. And we define this as the time lag. So in our grass fuels, we call them 1 hour fuels because they basically can stabilize to the humidity within about an hour. We call our 1/4 inch to 1 inch fuels 10-hour fuels. This is a highly critical size fuel that determines the intensity of the flaming front. The 10-hour fuels act as the primary mechanism that fire transitions from those very light grass fuels into the heavier fuels, the 100 and the 1,000-hour fuels. So the 10-hour fuels are very critical to wildland firefighters when it comes to their success at initial attack. As we move through the season, our 10-hour fuels are constantly monitored to give fire planners a better idea of the potential for initial attack fires to escape control throughout the season. And this chart here is a great chart, and we call this the hauling chart, but it's basically, official term is the fire characteristics chart. It gives us our tactical options when we're fighting fire, and it's basically based on the height of the flaming front. And so if you look over here on the lower right side of the screen, you see that the blue lines represent flame lengths. And so the lowest blue line that you see, 4-foot flame lengths. And you see the picture of the small guy swinging his tool. And what that means is that for flame lengths up to 4 feet, we can use hand crews right up against the fire's edge to put in our perimeter control line. But when we get past 4-foot flame lengths, we have to pull our hand crews back, and we can only use mechanized equipment like a bulldozer because the operator has a lot more protection from the amount of heat that's coming off those higher flame lengths. And so we use we use this concept to base our tactical options on every day when we're looking at the behavior of the fire. And as an example of how fire line intensities react to the vegetation, these are some pictures of the Thomas fire in 2017 that burned behind Santa Barbara. And this fire started out predominantly in a grass field type with a very, very extreme wind condition on it, the Santa Ana winds that we see in Southern California. But it transitioned itself into chaparral within hours of its ignition and became predominantly a chaparral fire, burning across the landscape for weeks. And you can see the intensities involved in a chaparral fire. But the next shot you're going to see is, even given those intensities and the ferocity of that fire and the moonscape that was left afterwards, the vegetation is amazingly resilient across California to fire. So I think I'll end this presentation with on a positive note that while fires are thought to be quite destructive and can be, particularly with the built environment, with the natural environment, we do see the resilience of our vegetation. For example, in the conifers or in the chaparral hillsides behind Santa Barbara. So this is a shot of the hillside behind the small town of Carpinteria, where the Thomas fire burned through with extreme intensity. And this was taken about 8 months after the fire, after some decent rains. And so it is quite a beautiful landscape now. And all of that chaparral is all growing back quite aggressively. So with that, and I could take questions as long as I still have some time left. And thank you for allowing me to share this.
Great, thank you, Rob. So while you've been talking, we have had a few questions coming in, and I thought maybe we take a few minutes. You do have a few minutes left before we roll it over to John to ask you a few of the questions that have been asked us. So one, so you mentioned as you went on actually several times about the importance of ladder fuels. Anything else? What strategies? So for instance, if you look at an area and you've gone in to do some planning work to decide what needs to be done to treat an area to improve its level of safety and security from fire, what kind of thought process do you go through when you're evaluating the area for? So are ladder fuels considered to be particularly important in the picture? Do you plan for ladder fuels in a particular way as opposed to other kinds of fuels?
We do, exactly. So when we're looking at a potential project, now we're talking about vegetation management, and in Santa Barbara County, our biggest concern is the impact of fire on our wildland urban interface. So many of our projects are adjacent to neighborhoods and built areas, and so a major strategy that we have is to break up the continuity of the fuel, make it a more patchy fuel bed. Typically, we're in chaparral, in the chaparral environment, and we never intend to completely remove the chaparral. There are negative environmental consequences to just whole scale type conversion of your vegetation to a grass field type. And so we really try to find a balance where we reduce the volume of fuel, we make it a patchier field bed, and when there is a forest component, for us, it's the coast live oak. That's a very typical hardwood tree that we see. We try to make some space between these forests of coastal live oak and the chaparral field beds that are adjacent to it. We see pretty significant impact of fire on those coast live oaks when they are embedded within a very dense stand of chaparral. However, when we can break up some of the continuity of the chaparral and also remove some of those surface fuels under the trees, that they're very resistant to fire. Fire will burn underneath coast live oaks and barely impact them at all. And so that's a major strategy that we use, is just breaking up the continuity of the fuel and creating what some vegetation management practitioners will term shaded fuel breaks. So looking at it from a distance, you'd barely tell that there was a fuel break there. So very different from the classic fuel breaks we saw back in the 1960s and 70s, where they bulldozed off ridge lines and tried to create a very defined break in the vegetation.
Awesome. I got two more questions I want to try to slip past you before we roll on over to John. So next question is, so of the fuel types that you described, which ones produce the most heat, the most fire? Is it the ground fuels, the ladder fuels, the aerial fuels? What's your experience with that?
So two concepts there. So when we look at ground fuel, surface fuel, the ladder fuels, the aerial fuels, if you have fire in the aerial component of your forest species, and that goes back to that slide of the crown fire situation. That is the most intense fire behavior we see. So whether the fire is burning in a hardwood canopy or in a conifer canopy, aerial fuel component, or even chaparral. So very mature chaparral species, 20 to 30 foot tall, when that chaparral is burning, it's essentially a crown fire. That is where we see the most intensities for sure. But it's interesting because that same canopy, when, given that it's well hydrated, so we're not talking drought years, because we see a lot of problems with timber canopies that would normally be resistant to fire being very susceptible to fire in our drought years, which increasingly we see more of. But in our non-drought years, where we've got sufficient soil moisture, that those timber species are healthy and hydrated, and if the surface fuels are broken up and there's some space between those trees, whether it's been by frequent natural fire intervals that have cleaned out the forest floor or through a vegetation management effort, the timber species are very resistant to fire, whether it's, again, coast hardwood species, valley hardwood species, or the conifers in our Sierra Nevadas.
Great. Okay. And last question, we'll roll over to John. So given the theme of this particular workshop, can you tell us anything at all in your experience, the experience you have had in dealing with fire in grazed and non-grazed grassland, shrubland ecosystems?
That's a great question. So Santa Barbara County is kind of a 50-50 split between what I would consider your typical California coastal rangelands. So these are rolling hills with, very large expanses of grass, some mixed in sagebrush species, and of course our hardwoods scattered about. That's pretty much all of our state responsibility area lands in the county of Santa Barbara. The other half of the county is the national forest, which is predominantly chaparral and some island patches of conifers, some legacy conifers that are up in our higher elevations. If you look at our fire history map in our county, all of our very large fires have occurred in the chaparral, predominantly Los Padres National Forest portions of our county. We have had some moderate-sized fires in our grasslands, but very easy to control those fires. We had a fire in our backcountry, the Zaka fire in 2007, that literally burned for 3 months through chaparral field beds, versus it would be a rarity to see a fire in our rangelands that lasted more than 2 or 3 days. And this is another interesting statistic in our county. All of our recorded structural loss from wildland fire has occurred where our wildland urban interface is adjacent to chaparral brushlands, where we have large areas of grassland in our county, and it's very rural, and there's a lot of patchwork of homes out there, ranches and small little communities. We have almost zero impact on our built environment, other than things like fence posts and that type of damage, but very little record of structural loss. So we do see that the grasslands are easier to control fires in. And regarding the grazing, we see a high number of initial attack fires in the grass in the early season, May and June, and that dramatically drops off throughout the year as our cattle ranching operations in Santa Barbara County, because we have a lot of cattle ranching going on still. As those hillsides become grazed off, the incidence of initial attack fires drops off dramatically. We almost don't see any rangeland or grass fires that spread into any of those actively, those active cattle ranches that we have. Now, on the sides of the freeways where there's no grazing going on the side of a highway, yeah, we still get the grass fires. They happen all along our freeways and we see it, but then they spread to the edge of an active ranch and they go out. And we also see this because of the impacts of vineyards too. So we kind of have, between vineyards and a lot of cows, we kind of become fireproof towards this time of year in that environment.
Great. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Rob. So by the way, Rob, as we're going to transition over to John now, there is a lot of questions in the chat box. So if you got a couple minutes to go through there and see which ones you can hit, I'm sure that the questions will be appreciated. So folks, our audience, thank you for the questions you're asking. We're not going to forget any of them. If we can't get them answered now, because we've got enough questions already to feed us for the next hour, we will address as many of them as we can in the new 1 hour session. We've got the open forum, so we're going to hang on to those and roll over to anything that Rob doesn't have time to address today. Now I'd like to transition over to another person with fuel and fire experience, and that's John Bailey. John works for the University of California at the Hopland Research Experiment Station. And John, I'll ask you quickly. Have you been able to get your PowerPoint set up, and do you need any assistance with that?
No, I think I'm all good to go, and it looks like I have access to share the screen, so we should be good.
Excellent. John, the floor is yours. Please introduce yourself and take it on.
All right. My name is John Bailey. I'm the director up here at the Hopland Research and Extension Center, and joining me is Alison Smith. She's our staff research associate. So what we're going to do is go through our experience here at Hopland. We had the river fire come through in early August of 2018. And we're going to kind of talk about the fire experience, but then also the effects on the landscape, particularly as it relates to how much grazing we've done. Right here, you can see this is the fire spreading down through the research center, and it was a classic backing fire. The fire spread across the top of the property and then backed down against the slope, and as evening wore on, against the wind. So we're part of UC A&R, the Ag and Natural Resources Division. And what A&R operates is all of your cooperative extension offices throughout the counties, farm advisors throughout California, focusing on the crops in their area. We also run 4-H programs, master gardeners, California naturalists, various statewide institutes around water, IGIS. So we're kind of like the 10th campus of the university, and spread it more broadly than all the rest of the campuses. Here at Hopland, we are one of 9 research and extension centers, and we are about 5,400 acres. We have a raising operation of sheep that has been the focus of most of our work over the last 70 years. Next year is our 70th anniversary. And we really focus on applied research, adaptive management, and then educational activities. Just to give you an idea of where we're talking about, you can see on the bottom of the screen, Santa Rosa, which is about an hour north of the Bay Area. And then over in the right-hand side of the screen, Woodland, which is just about a half an hour outside of Sacramento. So we're located in the Mayacamas Range, Coast Range, and we have a mixture of a lot of different types of vegetation. This is the center itself, it's about 5,400 acres. And we start at about 600 feet elevation with a little bit of irrigated pasture. And then we rise up to the very top of the center. We back onto BLM land. And we're at about 3,000 feet. We have a mixture of open rangeland, mixed oak woodlands, chaparral, and chamise. We don't have very much conifers. We have a couple of conifer plots and a little bit of Doug fir encroachment, but mostly our environment is oak woodlands, chaparral, rangeland. This is a photo of what the center itself looks like in a large portion. We mostly have a dominant annual grassland mix. We have, I think, 11 different species of oaks on the property, riparian zones, chaparral, and then we're doing varying amounts of grazing. We've done prescribed burns over the years, but we've never had a wildfire come through before. I'm going to hand it off to Alison now to talk about the sheep operation.
Thanks, John. So at this point, we have a mixed flock. We currently have about 145 adult sheep with about 35 to 50 lambs that we're keeping as replacements for next year. They are predominantly Targhee breed, which is a range breed. We've mixed in some Monadale and some Dorset, so we get a combination of the wool quality and a good meat for carcass quality as well. There have been sheep grazed on our property since 1951, and even before the UC bought it. But since the UC bought it, it's been solely sheep. We haven't had any cattle during that time. We are possibly looking at introducing some cattle for some mixed grazing species, but mostly the smaller animals, the sheep on here really have less soil erosion impacts, while we still get those really nice fire prevention grazing qualities. Sheep tend to graze closer to the ground. They don't do the browsing as much as goats will. So while they will, clear some of those ladder fuels up from the ground, they won't necessarily do as good of a job as, say, goats will, but they will do a pretty good combination of clearing out that grassland and getting rid of a few of those ladder fuels. The UC started out as solely a sheep research station. They had approximately 300 head of sheep. During the time of the fire, when the fire came through, we were at 470 sheep. Now we're down, like I said, to around 150.
And Alison, that was 3,000 sheep originally.
3,000, yep.
We've had a decreasing footprint of the sheep over time, which gives us a real gradient of how much grazing has happened and how the grazing footprint has shrunk.
Yeah, absolutely.
In this picture, you can see we've got the green grass growth in the spring. We're in a classic Mediterranean environment. We get about 30 inches of rain a year, and the fire hit in late July, early August. So as Rob was talking about, the fuel was very available. So this is a photo from the headquarters. You know, it got really close down to us. And again, this is the backing fire. It's going down through here, through pastures that we grazed. This was the final result. We ended up with about 2/3 of the center burned. And what you can see in here is a reverse color image where the red is, the green is red. And so the more red that you see, the greener the foliage was after the fire. In general, the upper part of the property has been grazed less in recent years. The footprint of the sheep has shrunk from up high to down to the lower pastures. And the gray is, you know, fairly consumed vegetation. The kind of lighter tones of red, or grayer tones of red, I guess, are areas where the canopy was damaged. And then bright red is where the canopy wasn't really touched. So we have a really moist north-facing creek on the top of the property. The fire skipped around that almost completely. And then these blackened areas down low are the grasslands. And then we had done some prescribed burns with CAL FIRE under a vegetation management plan. Those are those isolated patches. So this is the top of the property. I'm going to hand this off to Alison now to talk about how the grazing footprint has changed over time and what the effects were.
Right. So thanks, John. This is the top of the property looking down. You can see up towards the bottom of the screen, which is actually the upper portion of the property and higher elevation. There was quite a bit more chaparral. It was next to a brushy area. And so the fire burned much, much hotter than it did lower down where you can see the darker black, and that was through grasslands. You can see part of one indication of how much hotter it was burning at the top is you can see the canopy of the oak trees and how few green leaves and green canopies were left at the top, as opposed to if you go down to the bottom of the screen where it was more recently grazed. This particular shot, this particular area had been grazed about 2 years prior to the fire. So there was still definitely some residual effect from grazing, but it wasn't a consistent annual grazed spot at the time of the fire. You can see there are fewer open grassland areas as you get towards the top of the property here. And it's much more dense woodland. So once the fire got in the canopy, it really started to burn through that top and kill the oaks sort of from the bottom up all the way. We have had a ton of resprouting though since the fire in those oak trees. You can see some spots that are still green in there. Yep, up at the top, but we are having a huge amount of resprouts from the trunks down at the bottom. And so it wasn't, in this area, it was intense. It did kill those leaves. A lot of them were wilted from the heat as opposed to actually burned through. So it wasn't a burned canopy fire in this area, but it was able to scorch a lot of those trees. And so in this next shot, we have sort of a reverse north to south area up in that top right corner where it's all green. That is that top area where John showed you in the fire map that was all red. That's an area called Morrison Creek. The fire completely skipped over that canyon. So we can see this is a little bit of the top that we saw before, and also towards the east of the property. And so you can see as it goes towards the right of the screen, the burn just got more and more intense there. And that is an example of, we had not grazed that area in more than 10 years. So it just tore right through there. It started in the chaparral, burned incredibly hot. There was much more of a fuel load there, both grassland, shrub, trees, oak woodlands, madrone woodlands. There was just a huge, the fire intensity was really high there. We had a lot of ladder fuels that had been built up. And so we had a fairly high oak mortality there, but again, we are seeing a lot of resprouting in this area at this point, both in the chaparral and in the hardwood forests. And then this next slide is another area that was a ridgeline. This is one of our biological reserve areas on the property. We have 3 of those, and they are actually have never been grazed since the UC purchased the property. So it's been 70 years, they haven't been grazed. And on sort of the right half of this, there is quite a bit of open grassland, but the oak stands were completely undisturbed, had a ton of ladder fuels. And by the time the fire got here, it was incredibly hot. We had a very, very high oak mortality. So if we look at the whole property and how the fire was burning, in our grazed areas, we see way more oak survival than we do in the ungrazed areas where the fire was able to burn hotter and for longer. We did actually get canopy fire in these areas because it was so hot that just burned the entire tree, and they're not resprouting and not coming back. So if we look here, these are some of our lower pastures that have been grazed. Really more recently, we see a lot of open grassland here, a lot more open grassland, although we still do have that patchy effect, but see how much more green there is. Up towards the upper left part of that, you can see the grasslands look much more black, and you can see sort of a ring around those oak trees there. That had been a prescribed fire about a month before the wildland fire came through. So it did reburn those areas. However, it did not touch those oak trees. Those are still all green. But you can see in the previously grazed areas, which had been grazed again a couple years before, in most of the picture here, you still have a lot of green on the top of those oaks. So we had a lot of oak survival in this area. It was much higher. The fire went through those grassland areas pretty quickly. There wasn't a ton of ladder fuel there for it to spread. And so you can just really see the difference here between a grazing land fire and complete wildland fire that we showed you in the slide before. So then if we look at the next slide here, this is a pasture boundary that we've had. The pasture on the upper left was grazed fairly heavily, and annually. Every year we had sheep in there, we had them graze it pretty well, then we would move them out. When the fire came through here, we had just pulled them out about 2 weeks before, which was really fortunate. Down in the lower, sort of looking at that diagonal, the lower right, that had not been grazed for at least 5 years, 5 to 10 years. And you can see what a huge difference that made in the oak burning, as well as the grassland burning. Over here on the left, in the upper left, the fire just tore through that grassland so fast that it just didn't have a chance to catch most of those oaks and ladder fuels. There just wasn't much to burn. So it just spread really fast through there and burned out. We had very few smoldering trees afterwards. And you can really see with this aerial view, the next slide is a much more distinct view of the grassland, but this aerial view is really nice to see the difference between the oak mortalities, and most of those hardwoods are oaks. Here you go. Left side obviously had just been grazed, right side had a lot of buildup on the ground. And it just burned longer and hotter with more of those ground fuels and more of those ladder fuels on the right. And so it really is, I think this is the most telling picture we have of this fire and what happened, and how the grazing really, really can benefit your grasslands and your rangelands, especially if a fire comes through.
Thanks, Alison. So kind of what we've been talking about so far is our observations on the ground. And then we did a high resolution drone map of the entire burn site. So then our main mission here is research. So we're going to pivot now into kind of the what's been happening in the research on the ground and preliminary results. So what I'm going to share now is kind of talking with the researchers about their preliminary results. This isn't peer reviewed, it hasn't gone out into journals yet, so I just want to make that observation ahead of time. So one of the people who's been doing work in the time since the fire and for years beforehand is Dr. Valerie Evener from UC Davis, and she already had 38 grassland plots established across the center. So she had great beforehand data and then post-fire data. What she found was that the grazed pastures had less seed death than the ungrazed. And you can see that here, you know, where it was ungrazed, there was much greater intensity and heat on the ground level, which then killed off more of the seed bank. Whereas the ungrazed, the fire skipped around more, left a lot more seeds available to grow. Also, the grazed pastures had greater root biomass. So especially in perennials, this can lead to quicker recovery after fire. And this is kind of counterintuitive. You might think, okay, well, the grazing has been chewing away at the plants. How are they having greater root biomass? Well, the grazing can actually stimulate root growth. And then you have a greater energy pool underground for that plant, if it's a perennial, to then regrow afterwards. There's also hypotheses that this can lead to greater carbon sequestration in grazed pastures. So in terms of research on climate change and ways that we can sequester more carbon out of the atmosphere, that's a potential tool. So there's going to be some more projects starting up here looking at that, especially in relation to grazing. And as we mentioned before, we're all sheep. So we're looking at layering in cattle so we can study multi-species grazing and co-grazing as best tools for that. Another thing she found is that there were more wildflowers and greater plant diversity in the grazed pastures. So this is kind of graphing that out. And what we see is here is in the top graph, looking at ungrazed pastures that were not burned, that were burned by prescribed fire, and that were burned by wildfire. And actually in the ungrazed pastures, even wildfire left a greater amount of seeds than the prescribed burn. And that's probably due to the timing of the fire events where, you know, if you have a prescribed burn that's usually happening in the late spring, early summer, the seeds might still be on the plant and haven't fallen down. And so they're more susceptible to burning. The bigger effect was looking at in the grazed pastures when we had the wildfire event come through. The grazed pastures have a much more survival of the forbs, and forbs are all basically herbaceous plants that are not grasses. So again, it's showing, you know, you have a much greater diversity of forbs that survive the fire in seed form and are able to then regrow afterwards. This is looking at another result from her that the in wildfire events in grazed pastures, there's a greater amount of legumes and forbs that survive compared to grasses and compared to in prescribed fire. And also in the ungrazed pastures, when the wildfire came through, there was more of a loss of forbs and legumes compared to grasses. Another project we have going on site is by Dr. Michael Jones. He's our local forestry cooperative extension advisor, and he's looking at the oaks as opposed to the rangeland. So what he was mentioning is that, you know, definitely it has a substantial impact on the fire behavior, the amount of grazing, lower intensity in the grazed pastures, and in part this is due to, especially in those pastures that have not been grazed for a long time, there's been more accumulation of those ladder fuels that Rob talked about. So it you know, over the years, the brush is allowed to grow in under the trees without grazing presence, keeping it in grassland. And then those ladder fuels of those brushes then allow the fire to leap from the ground fuels up into the trees. there were hardly any top kills in trees or in pastures where we had grazed recently. And in some of the pastures that were most recently grazed, not even all of the grass was consumed. Oops, let me go back to that. Then also, it's mixed effects. So one thing that he did find as well is that there's much lower recruitment of oaks in the pastures that have been grazed. So it protected the standing oaks, but because of the presence of the grazers, there was less of an acorn seed bank. And so we're seeing a lot less oak regrowth of new seedlings coming up in those grazed pastures. If you're wanting to keep your oak woodlands healthy, and you've been grazing a lot after a fire event, you probably need to go out and plant and protect those seedlings that are coming up. Otherwise, you're really not going to see any oak recruitment. And then looking at the fire, even in the grazed and the ungrazed pastures altogether, what he's been finding is originally after the fire event went through, he thought that these trees that had the brown canopies, looking at those, that we might have up to 90% mortality of oaks in some of those ungrazed pastures. But what he is finding is that it's really probably closer to 40%, and that it might have killed the top, but it's resprouting from the base. And resprouting from the base, it has a lot more energy to grow that tree faster. So 2 years after the fire, we're already seeing 10-foot tall black oaks resprouting from the base. And so this is just kind of a reminder to people that you might think that an oak tree is dead after the fire event comes through, but if it's not a hazard tree, don't cut it down right away. It may regrow. Some of them have regrown from the top even, where we thought they were killed at the top, but a lot of the others have regrown from the base. And so what happens after a lot of fire events is property owners want to go in and they want to clear out all those dead looking trees. But if you wait 1, 2, sometimes even 3 years, you're going to see a lot better recovery of your oak woodlands. So just in summary, what we really saw with grazing, that it reduced the fire intensity by a lower fuel load, keeping those ladder fuels down and keeping the grass lower helped keep the fire out of the canopy of the trees, which resulted in less top-killed oaks in the grazed pastures and also less damage to the surviving trees. And then the impact on the rangeland, with the grazing, there was less seed mortality, so more diversity to be able to regrow afterwards. And the grazing may lead to greater carbon sequestration and drought resilience in those pastures that are grazed. So I think my time's about up, but this is our contact here, Hopland. If you want to check out our website, we have a lot of different links of information about the fire event and afterwards, and just in general, the research and extension work that we do here. And then you can email me or call me with questions about the site itself or research and extension. And then Alison does the management of our research and sheep programs. So she's a good contact for any specific questions around that. But we'll also be on to answer questions after this. Thank you.
Alison, John, thank you very much for that. Tell you what, we do have a little bit of extra time. Would you mind fielding some questions? So we've got quite a few. It'll you can either spend the next 30 minutes typing out answers, or I can just field them to you. We can just talk them out. How about let me just pitch a few questions to you, and we'll see how this goes. So Alison, so let's go with this. So there have been a couple of questions about the kind of vegetation you have out there. So the one question was, are the grasses that you have up at Hopland, are they native grasses or non-native grasses or some mixed kind of thing? What do you have up there in terms of your grass or rangeland grass species composition?
There's a definite mixture, but it's mostly annual dominated and majority non-native, with it being grazed before the UC took it over, it was a sheep and cattle ranch. So there's been a lot of different seeding operations going on in different pastures. So in some areas, we've got a good population of wild oats, some ryegrass, some herding grass and orchard grass, which has been seeded in. Also a fair amount of subclovers from, again, seeding operations to support sheep. And then we've got The problem with invasives coming in, you know, we've done a fairly good job of managing star thistle, which is a problem in California rangelands in general. But we do have barbed goat grass and Medusa head, both of which are really non-palatable species for grazers, both domestic and wild. So that's a big problem coming in. And we are starting to use prescribed burning more as a tool to try to control those invasives, where you can get a window in the late May, early June, where a lot of the natives might have already seeded out and dropped their seeds. And then the goat grass in particular doesn't mature until later. So you can come through with prescribed fire and burn that out. And then we've also got, let me just go, well, you guys can't see it now because I'm not sharing the screen. Soft chess, you know, we also have a fair amount of that. And then a pretty good diversity of native species, but they have been, they've been decreased over the years by some of the grazing.
Great, thank you. Do you have any sense of the actual mortality on the oak trees as a result of those burns?
I think right now our best estimate is about 40% overall across the station. Okay. But again, a lot of those trees, the top was killed, and so they're resprouting from the base of the trunk. So that 40% mortality can be kind of deceiving when you look at the landscape, because particularly in the upper areas and the areas that weren't grazed, look out there, you might think 75 to 80% of the trees have been killed. But then when you look closer, you'll see those resprouts that are getting up into the 6 to 10 foot range already. And Alison, chime in on any of this. I mean, you're out there in the pasture a lot more. So.
Yeah, no, you're doing great, John.
we do have a few questions having to do with grazing and prescribed fire. You guys have any comments about, you know, the complementarity or not of prescribed burning in the kind of ecosystems that Hopland is in, and in connection with grazing?
You know, we've actually been trying to do more prescribed burns. There was sort of a period of maybe about 10 years here where there wasn't a lot of prescribed burning going on. And so we're just getting back into it, you know, unfortunately with the climate change and the weather change, and you really do have a really small window, especially if you're trying specifically to control invasive species and you're not just using your prescribed burn to reduce your fuel load. If you're doing it with a purpose like controlling invasive species, and that's one of our biggest concerns here, or one of our biggest vegetation management, you know, goals is to sort of target that towards the invasive species. And so we've just had a hard time with timing in the past couple of years, getting as many prescribed burns done as we would like. But I think when used in combination with grazing, it really is something that needs to be done annually, as much as you can for a few years in a row to have that really effective result that you're looking for.
Yeah, and especially to control some of these invasives, you need 2 to 3 years of back-to-back annual prescribed burns to really eliminate them from the seed bank. And we have had a vegetation management plan with CAL FIRE, which is a 3-year plan, and we had certain areas set up for those burns. What we ran into is that there was so much fire activity across the state that CAL FIRE wasn't able to do those burns 2 out of the 3 years. And so now we're entering into a 10-year vegetation treatment plan with CAL FIRE, which will cover the whole property and allow us more flexibility to do different burns. Because in the vegetation management plan, it was only those pastures that we'd identified at the beginning of the 3 years. There wasn't a lot of flexibility built in. So we definitely hope to use prescribed burns as a more flexible tool in the future. And then also something that's starting to be developed more in the state is prescribed burn associations. I know that my colleagues up in Humboldt County, Lania, Quinn Davidson, and Jeff Stackhouse have really been pushing forward on that. And then Matthew Shapiro down in Southern California as well. And these are groups that will form in communities, get trained, share safety gear, often work with CAL FIRE to make sure, we'll always work with CAL FIRE to make sure that the burns are approved, and sometimes work with them on the labor and enactment of the burn. And sometimes they'll cut their own lines and hire in their own prescribed burn boss who ensures that the operations are safe. And that's a tool that is starting to be adopted more because CAL FIRE has great resources, but they're also limited. And the amount of acreage that really should probably be burnt in California every year on an ongoing basis is like 90% higher than what CAL FIRE can manage on their own. And then grazing can also be a great tool. I mean, I'm really hopeful that through these kind of conversations, it will be seen as a fire prevention and management tool even more, so that we can start to use animals in targeted grazing operations to help protect our, especially those wildland urban interfaces that Rob brought up.
Great. Okay. Okay, Rose. So
Mark,
yes,
Mark,
sir.
Hi, Mark. Can I add one just a little bit to that last answer? Just to describe a little bit better, like that private effort at prescribed fire. So in Santa Barbara County, we've had this very, very long history of our local range improvement association conducting rangeland prescribed fires. For their part, they were looking at increasing grass grazing opportunities for their cattle. But the county fire department, going all the way back to the 1920s, literally the formation of our fire department was to support these range improvement burns because at the time, the Santa Barbara County Forestry Department, that's what we were called, we saw that as one of our primary ways of decreasing large fire spread throughout the county, was working in cooperation with the Range Improvement Association. That association still exists, and 2 days ago we conducted a range improvement burn here in Santa Barbara County and burned 200 acres. The ranch group conducted the burn, and the county fire department engaged themselves to keep the fire in check and not allow it to spread outside its containment line. So it's actually starting up again, and we're hoping that it becomes a viable option for us, because it is absolutely true that there's not enough fire resources to do it on their own. If prescribed fire is going to be an option in the state of California, there has to be some effort on the private side.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so that reminds me that our third session on this, the 19th. So on that particular day, we're going to focus entirely on public opportunities for communities for developing their own fire plans and engaging. So we're going to have extension staff, including Matthew Shapiro, who's here with us today, and others, talking about how do you set up your own community fire plan. But the fire planning part rolls back to some other questions. So Alison and John, so several people have asked, so does Hopland have a fuels management plan for the facility of some kind? And is it a thing that you might be able to share with other organizations to show how you have thought out how to manage fuels on facility by grazing, by prescribed fire and other treatments? That's a question.
Right. Yeah. We have a semi-outdated plan that we're working on revising currently, and working with CAL FIRE on this vegetation treatment plan for the next 10 years is kind of spurring that process on. It's one of those things that it's difficult with state budgets cutting our staff and reducing our capabilities kind of in-house to keep everything fresh. So definitely that's a big target for us. I mean, I'm happy to share what we have, which is from, I believe, the late 90s at this point, but it was looking out into the 10-15 year time frame. And then I think it'll probably be early 2021 by the time we have the vegetation treatment plan in place. And then we do have our own grazing management plans in-house for how and where we're managing the sheep and grazing those on the lower parts of the property. We're also in the process of developing a larger grazing management plan involving cattle. So one of the things that Alison mentioned is, due to state budget cuts, we reduced our flock from about 500 breeding ewes down to about 175, which has really reduced our grazing footprint at a time when I'd really like to increase it. So we'll be developing cattle leases to work with private producers to lease out parts of the property. And we're looking at a couple of phases there. So again, those will be looking at probably early 2021 by the time we have at least phase one ready to go.
Great, that's good to know. I know that my team here at Cal Poly, we're working with Sonoma County and trying to develop a countywide method of estimating fuels and maybe working in grazing and prescribed burning other treatments to manage the fuels all around the county. But those processes are large, and they have a lot of moving parts. But I think that, clearly there's interest out here for other people wanting to have some example integrated fuel management plans that they can kind of base their own projects around. So I think that the more of us that get involved in these processes and begin developing what we think are some good plans, like when you guys get yours updated, I think that there'd be a lot of interest in folks seeing if you would be willing to share that, so people could kind of develop the beginnings of their own plans around it.
And now
another question. Oh, go John.
If I sent those to you, Mark, then you're able to share them out to the group.
Yeah, absolutely, we will do that. And the question was, annual grasses, perennial grasses. In your experience, does fire behave any differently between stands of annuals and stands of perennials?
You know what, if Rob has any comments on that, I mean, we weren't able to get very much into the fire zone itself. The perennials around here will tend to stay green a little bit longer. So there's a little bit more moisture in that fuel, but Rob, with his experience fighting fires in a lot of different contexts, maybe will speak to that better.
Yeah, for sure. Exactly that. Our annual grasses, which of course, a lot of them are the invasives that have been here for a long time, but technically they're invasive European grasses. They cure out very, very dry, by June, July, and burn very quickly, and quite honestly contribute to most of our high volume of fires in California. There's not a lot of our native perennial grasses left, like in Santa Barbara County, but we do see some of them. There's a lot of newer perennial grasses that are growing like on the sides of the freeways that have been actually planted there for erosion control. And those types of perennial grasses actually do remain greener longer and are more fire resistant. And then if you go up into high elevation in the Sierra Nevadas, there are tons and tons of natural meadows that are full of perennial grasses that they won't burn until like September by the time they finally dry out. So in general, yes, annual grasses are more flammable, and perennials they burn slower.
Yeah, and then of course in natural semi-arid grasslands, the perennials are often spaced apart from each other. The big thing that we deal with the annual grasses is they grow as a carpet. And so it's really great for conducting fuels. Rob, as you said earlier, so it's all about how the fuel bed is organized. A normal perennial grassland fuel bed in California is spotty, and an annual grass bed is continuous. And so that's one of the things that we wrestle with, isn't it? Let's see, anything else? Yeah, okay. So goats. So Alison, lots of questions about goats. So why haven't you guys been running goats up there at Hopland?
Yeah, so I typed in a couple of answers about this, but the quick answer is that we have a fair number of sensitive plant areas and rare and endangered plant species on the property. Those are the sorts of things that goats absolutely love and will decimate. So it's we're not totally close to it. We're not opposed to it. We have had a couple of research projects up here in the past, like 20 years ago, that involved goats. But for us, it's just a lot of planning and a lot more labor and consideration for bringing goats in. So yeah, we're looking at, previously, most of these research centers were focused on one specific type of agriculture. The huge numbers of sheep that they had here before were for production flock only. And that was what the UC was focusing on. And as sort of agriculture in California changes, we're also looking at sort of changing the focus of our ag research and our outreach and education to where we're hoping to sort of get move towards a more sort of mixed ecosystem biodynamic type approach that's a little more relevant to the folks that we have living here locally that need the outreach and the education. And so, our first step is to bring in cattle because it's easier for us to do than bringing in goats. There are a lot of disease things that you need to look at because the diseases with sheep and goats are so similar. There's a lot of labor and consideration, with a lot more so with mixing goats and sheep than there are with cattle. I know somebody was asking also about like mineral supplements for goats and sheep. Sheep can't have any copper. They tend to need a higher level of selenium, at least around here, than goats do. That being said, I know a number of contract grazers that run goats and sheep together. They seem to have a problem, but I don't know what they do for mineral supplements. Probably the way I would do it, if I was going to do it here, would be to run them in a rotation, a grazing rotation separately. So I would put the sheep through first, have them graze the grasses down, and then run the goats through and have them browse those latter fuels a little bit more. That way, if you're keeping the two species a little bit separate, you can offer your minerals free choice separately. It makes gathering a whole lot easier because sheep and goats will herd very, very differently. And so that would be my short answer to that. Is it's not out of the question. They can be very useful. For our situation, it's going to be difficult to mix in goats here.
Great. Thank you, Alison. Let's see, Robin asked in reference to your comment about the goats eating the endangered species. So sheep will also eat endangered species, all depending on what they are.
They will, absolutely. But ours tend to leave them alone most of the time. So,
right. Yeah. I mean, for the audience, it's not a matter of whether the plant is endangered or not that will attract or not attract a goat or a sheep. It's all a matter of what kind of endangered plant it is.
yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Let's see. This is good. So I'm scanning through to see what else we've got. Okay. And I'm assuming that the natural wild ungulate component in that area was probably chiefly deer and elk, but before you guys brought in the domestic ungulates. Or
right. We do have a large population of Columbian black-tailed deer here. We don't have any elk here anymore. I'm sure there were before the ranchers moved in. There are some just a little bit north of us in Potter Valley. But we have, I think John can maybe address this where Mike Jones has talked about it, but I know the deer really love to browse on those oak seedlings. And so that has been a problem. We can put cages around the smaller oaks, or when we restore them and do some replanting of oaks, we can keep cages out for our sheep and cattle grazers, but sort of in the non-pasture land woodland areas, we do have a lot. We'll see madrones sprouting up and oak sprouting up in the same areas, and the deer will always go for those oak sprouts.
Yeah, there's a question I see from Kelly in the chat about, is there oak recruitment in the areas where sheep are grazing at the Hopland Research property? There's not very much. And then even outside of where the sheep graze, there's not very much. What we're seeing across our region in California is that the live oak species are recruiting themselves, but the white and the black oaks are not very much. And then to Alison's point, we have an area on the center here that's, I don't know what it is, 10 acres that's been deer fenced for about 30 years. And in there, we see a lot of recruitment. So the deer are definitely having a major effect. The only difference between the area inside the fence and outside is that deer have been excluded because that's a pasture that's not currently grazed by sheep anyway. That's the only area where we're seeing really good recruitment of all oak species.
Okay. I want to kind of push things back around to the main focus for today, which is on fuels. So you guys have grazing animals. So, I mean, do you have any sense, John and Alison too, about the rate of fuel accumulation in that particular environment where Hopland is? I mean, this is the thing that I'm personally curious about, is learning, at what levels different kinds of plant communities tend to generate fuels that accumulate over time. Is that a thing you have gotten around to thinking about or trying to investigate?
Yeah, I don't have any quantified data on that here at this point, but what I think we've been seeing, and Alison out on the ground too, letting chiming into your perspective, is that especially in those areas that have been not grazed for 5 or 10 years plus, you get more of those woody understory shrubs and bushes growing up. And if you keep grazing pressure, even occasionally, the sheep will browse them down somewhat. Goats will do a better job. So sheep will focus more on the grass and the forb species, the herbaceous types, whereas goats, they'll get up on their hind legs and browse and knock down semi-woody vegetation. So if you have a long lag time from when you've been grazing, then you're going to have more of those ladder fuels build up. And then that's when you have problems. So occasional pulse grazing coming through can really help keep those ladder fuels from fully developing.
Yeah, I think you're right. One thing, John, that it also is totally dependent on weather. In some of these open oak grasslands, if you get year after year of fairly good rain or late rain where you have a ton of germination and really quick growth, you get that really deep thatch building up of grassland fuels, and that can, the ladder fuels and the bushy types of fuels don't tend to vary quite as much with the seasonal rainfall, but the grasses really will, and we can see a pretty big difference from year to year with the grassland fuel coming in with the weather, if you're not grazing.
Okay, let's see. So Rob, we've got a couple of questions for you if you're still there. Matthew Shapiro, you're out there. I'm tempted to call you in because we still have a little bit of few minutes and the questions are beginning to tend this way. So Matthew, if you're out there, you can unmute yourself, and I got a couple questions to pitch at you as well. But Rob, if you're online, there was a question about the management of chaparral fuels in Santa Barbara County as well, and I want to make sure that we try to get that covered also. Ah, there you are. Sorry to pull you back, but so Rob, there was a question about how Santa Barbara County is addressing chaparral fuels and the Range Improvement Association / Prescribed Burn Association. Can you talk to us a little bit about, so here we have, so the question is fuels management. What kind of, does Santa Barbara County have a kind of a strategy or a plan for how to try and address that?
We do. So we have complex wildfire issues here, as I'm sure some people know. We have our very dense south coast with a backdrop of the San Ynez Mountains, which are very steep, covered in chaparral right down into our neighborhoods. Really, opportunities for grazing and rangeland type management is very limited. And operations for prescribed or options for prescribed fire behind those wildland urban interface areas are also very difficult on the Santa Barbara South Coast. The chaparral down there tends to be relatively non-combustible for much of the year until it's not. And then when it becomes combustible, it rips when we have our sundowner winds and our it's seasonal drying. So it's very difficult to find a window to do any type of landscape level work. So what we do in those areas is we use hand crews to do what we call community defensible space field treatments, or we basically add to the defensible space around our neighborhoods by putting in 100 or a 200 foot wide field break, typically not removing all the vegetation. Chaparral has a lot of benefits. It stabilizes the soil. There's a lot of habitat value. So we just try to thin the chaparral, make it a patchier arrangement or continuity, and reduce the flammability and intensity of fire coming into the chaparral. It's a delicate balance. Now, in our more central and northern parts of the county, outside the national forest, as I described, it's rolling hills with grass, hardwoods like oaks, coast live oak, valley oak, white oak, and then predominantly the softer chaparral species like sage, a lot of sagebrush. And so where we do most of our either agency prescribed burning, which is through the Vegetation Management Program, programmatic EIR, or when we are helping to support the Range Improvement Association doing burns on the private side, those tend to be in the grass and sagebrush. And you know, the sagebrush has a much lower fire return interval. It bounces back from fire. You know, 10 years is about all you're going to get for reducing its flammability and combustibility. But there is some benefit to us from a fire protection standpoint. For the ranch communities, they get a lot more areas to graze their cattle, and so those are the areas where we do our prescribed fire projects. And then we have some areas where we put in traditional field breaks, not a lot. We have a couple projects where we're putting in some. And these are your ridge top field breaks designed to facilitate strategic fire control. So areas where if we have an extremely intense fire, we can back off to a field break and have a safer place for the firefighters that are engaged in indirect firefighting, using backfiring operations and tactics like that to create some kind of control barrier to the fire. That's kind of what, you know, the national forests down in California, in Southern California predominantly, really took that approach in the 60s, 70s, and 80s with thousands of miles of field break put across all the ridge tops in a lot of the Southern California forests. That's really not really the main strategy anymore, but there are applications for that. So it's kind of a mixed bag. You know, it's like the energy debate, like sort of a, you know, everything's on the table, and you just have to look at it as a vegetation management practitioner and go, what I want to do the least impact to the environment in terms of, you know, negatively impacting the ecology and having impacts on the soil in terms of erosion and then visual impacts. You know, we have our county is predominantly people that live here because of the environment. They want to see the natural environment around them. They don't want to see a lot of human changes to the environment in terms of visual and that. And so those are just the challenges we have. I think we're striking that balance. You know, these discussions are great. And as I alliterated earlier, just the grazing on the private ranch side in our county does unbelievable amounts of fire protection for us. It really kind of almost fireproofs our landscape across the lower elevations in our county.
This is Matthew. Can you hear me? I might add on to Rob's responses.
Yes, we can hear you, Matt.
Great. Yeah, I think put it just right. I wanted to add a piece there you didn't touch on, which is, and I don't mean to spoil the presentation that I plan to give in a couple of weeks, but there has been and continues to be really cooperation between Santa Barbara County Fire, which is our CAL FIRE equivalent, and the Prescribed Burn Association and Improvement Association. But more specifically, the collaboration has gotten this granular, choosing areas of county that are good candidates, EMP burn through county fire, and other areas that are good candidates for range improved burns, and strategizing and look 3 to 10 years out and working with that kind of intimacy and closeness, able to really make sure that the sort of things that really have a higher priority vegetation management comes to wildfire are taken care of by county fire, locally sometimes because prescribed burns and complex and topography more.
Matthew, unfortunately, your connection is breaking up pretty badly. We can hear you a little bit, but not very clearly. So
maybe I'll do it for a couple of weeks from now.
Yeah, hang on to that idea. So I think if I caught it right, and Rob can correct me, but so I think Matthew was just explaining that in Santa Barbara County, coming up with the fuel management planning was involving the integration of numerous different agencies and organizations, plus the prescribed Rangeland Improvement Association or Prescribed Burning Association. So it takes a team effort in order to pull these things together and work the details out. Is that more or less right?
It does. And just when my screen was blanked out, it's because I was actually on the phone with my vegetation management program coordinator, and he was asking me about a prescribed burn we have, and kind of lamenting some of our challenges from some other chiefs that don't ever want to burn when it's fire weather. And so it's very challenging, not only externally, because a lot of the public, they just think we're crazy to be putting fire on the landscape purposefully. We also have a lot of concerns from some of our urban populations that we're generating smoke, and that's not desirable for a lot of people to breathe that smoke or even to see it. But we also have challenges internally, just because, you know, you're letting the genie out of the bottle when you light fire on the landscape, and there's always a risk. And we can all look at all the times that prescribed fires went bad and even burned down homes. So it's a challenging endeavor. It has to be looked at thoughtfully. It's not impossible to do. We've been doing it for a long time here. As I said, my fire department was created in the late 1920s to support the range improvement burning that was happening. Just to illustrate the level of that amount of land management that was occurring on the private side back then. And this goes all the way through until about the late 1970s, really peaking in the 1960s. The Range Improvement Association in the county of Santa Barbara was burning on average about 10,000 acres a year in that decade of the 1960s. So that's really amazing when you think about it. That's a lot. You know, if every county had 10,000 acres of prescribed fire going, you know, Governor Newsom would be hitting his target, and Board of Forestry would be happy, and CAL FIRE would be happy, and everybody'd be high-fiving. I mean, we're reaching that target with wildfire for sure, but not with our managed efforts. So now I don't think we could ever repeat that because we have a much more complex dynamic situation with our demographics and population and all that, and just the growth of urban areas. But there are opportunities and there are ways that we can make these programs work on a little bit smaller scale for sure.
Yeah, well, that topic, and John and Alison, I plan to loop you guys back into this conversation some more, but you know, the whole point of this 3-week series, these workshops, is to talk about how individual communities around California can think about their own fire defense and fire protection and the management of fuels in your communities around in your WUI zones and in your rural landscapes. You have to think forward about them. So Rob, you know, the work that you and Matthew are both doing, you guys are having to think forward, probably not just a couple years, but a couple decades actually, about the kind of fuel accumulations and what can you do. And so one of the reasons why RMAC wanted to have these workshops was to get people discussing the fuels, discussing some of the treatment options, including animals, and discussing how do you organize a community and how do you put a plan together? Because Rob, we've had some great questions asked about, all right, so who's got a copy of a plan that we can borrow, that we can spin something off of? So that's what I was kind of talking to Alison and John. But Rob, also, you're working on developing plans for managing particular areas, and you're in the part of the process at the county level where you're trying to take all those individual plans and string them together into a kind of a large collection where you kind of a regular schedule, if that were possible, of continuing that work. And so this is not an easy thing to do, but we have a lot of people here online and here at the front desk among the panelists who understand something about how to do this. And we're trying to get all these pieces to connect.
Yeah, and the grazing part is very important. So, you know, as I've traveled across California and heading off to different fires over the years and seeing particularly like you look at the foothill communities in the Sierra Nevadas where we're having serious fire problems, much more so than we used to. Particularly in CAL FIRE's jurisdictions down in the lower elevations. You can't help but think that some of that is due to changing practices across the landscape. In other words, you know, diminished ranching, diminished grazing. And you see it, you drive up into the foothills, and as you get out of the farm belt, you see a lot of open grassland hills the grass is 3 feet tall, and it's July, and you're going, wow, that's weird. How come it's not grazed off? And it's really, really tough when you get a big grass fire burning in very, very intense fire weather conditions. So fires in August, you know, July, August, with the changing climate we have, when you have fire moving really fast through those grass field types, we used to be able to get ahead of it with our ground forces, and it's getting tougher once those grass fires move into chaparral and into the lower elevation timber, which is, as we know, drought stressed and bug killed. It's gone. It's done. We have the Creek Fire and the August Complex and the Camp Fire and all these other horrible fires that we've been seeing that just burn on and on and on. So it's really important, I think, to take a look at what's changing in terms of our use of the land, particularly the use of prescribed herbivory and, you know, agricultural grazing practices.
Yeah, the river fire that burned our property here started down on a roadside and then spread up through a ranch where grazing had halted. And so there were, on older maps and satellite images, roads that were thought to be defensible, but then with the lack of grazing, the grasses had grown up so high that it just skipped right over the road. And then by the time there was enough response, it was already in the chaparral. So especially along those areas of the human interface, having grazing could be a really important tool for keeping these human-caused fires from spreading out into the wildlands.
Yeah, and it's, as we all know, I'm the fire marshal down here, so fire prevention is our thing. We all know that like the budgets go to fire suppression, and that makes sense. We got to deal with the fires as they happen. But gosh, if you got to think, if you just spent a hundredth of what the budget's been this year on fire suppression, if you spent that on all these different concepts, and really trying to come up with good cohesive projects that mitigate the risk before the fires, we'd have what we need, or we'd be a long ways there. So that's really the challenge, I think, is funding these projects. When it's a cattle ranch, it's funded by itself. But even, I talk to a lot of ranchers and they say, yeah, we don't know how much longer we can do this. It's their family's ranch, it's their tradition. But they do, they're facing changes in the economy and just more difficulties in keeping their operations going. And, the grandkids don't have any interest in being ranchers and move on, and the ranches get sold off. So I think that it's a holistic issue, and people just need to be aware, if we lose grazing across the state, we're just going to have a lot more fires. That's the fact. We're seeing it in Mediterranean Europe, where they grazed for centuries and millennia, and then now they don't as much, and now they're getting all kinds of fires burning off the interface.
Yeah, it seems like there needs to be some kind of tool developed where livestock owners and managers are compensated for their grazing services or doing fuels reduction. One of the things that Alison brought up is the changing face of the research and the flock here at Hopland. There's like 10% of the sheep that there were in California in the 1950s when this place started. And people have gone more to cattle, but also there's a lot of the landscape around here has been purchased by people who are not ranchers themselves and have a mindset of, okay, I want to get human impacts off the land. So they buy a piece of property, they cancel their grazing lease, or they don't have cattle themselves. And that's what happened to the neighboring property here. And then all of a sudden you don't have any way you don't have the animals available to even move onto the property. So without some kind of economic tool to help compensate for these grazing services around human structures, it's going to be challenging. It often requires people to move outside. They have to be a mobile operation, which has its own costs. So contract grazing for fuels reduction is totally different than contract grazing to gain weight on your animals.
Yeah. Some other questions I just threw up on the screen really briefly. There was a question I think Sheila had asked about the mountain misery. So if you are not aware, the U.S. Forest Service maintains a database of vegetation that's been mapped on Forest Service lands, and includes all the data that may exist about that plant in terms of its fuel characteristics and its even forage characteristics for many animal species. Now, mind you, most of the wild plants out in the world, we have very little real substantial data on, but the Forest Service has accumulated whatever they could find. So Sheila, for that particular question, this is what I pulled up on the database. And this is called the Fire Effects Inventory System, FEIS, I believe. Yeah. And so in that online database, it describes mountain misery and the kind of wildlife species and livestock that had been observed by somebody at some time to actually consume it. So for the rest of you, if you have an interest in those kinds of things, that is one resource that's actually available for you out there. And yeah, John Muir. So John Muir, with respect to livestock grazing, so in his time, livestock grazing was highly abusive up in the Sierras. So he had a very dim view of all livestock species that were out in the mountains. The practice of livestock grazing has changed a lot. Not to say there are no abusers out there, but it's a different world than it was in Muir's time now. And we actually know that we can use the animals for some beneficial effects if they're being managed intelligently for the right objectives. Okay, I'll let that share go. Okay. Look, it's not my intention to drag the meeting out longer than necessary. I do want to try and answer any other questions that are out there. Next week's program is going to be specifically about the animals themselves. So what do animals do that's beneficial for modifying and altering fuels in a good way. How can the animals be used? What kind of animal species should you use? What kind of things will they eat? All that we're going to be discussing next week. We're going to have a series of several people, both who've done research work with animals in actually deliberately trying to manage fuels, and some people who actually have their own business enterprises where they go around and use their animals, goats and sheep and whatnot, to manage fuels for other people. And so we're going to have a chance to have a panel discussion like this with those people. So there'll be a lot of conversation about the animals this next week. Right. So Rob, John, Alison, coming up on noon. I'll give all of you a chance. If there's anything else you want to kind of end with your conversations about fuels and fuel management and things that you didn't work into your presentations, now would be a great time to throw it out there before we close this part of the program.
I guess I would just say that animals have a huge role to play in our ecosystems here in California. You know, there were historically very different grasslands. Like we mentioned, there were perennial grasslands throughout much of California. There was a lot more prescribed burning in the prehistoric past, and we need to bring some of those tools back more. We're starting to with prescribed fire, but we really need to make good use of our livestock, because we now have annual grasslands in most places, not perennials. And these grasslands are more adapted to grazers. And so you might, if you're coming from an urban environment, think that it's better to leave your environment untouched because it's going to return to the natural state, but it won't, because it's new annual species that weren't here historically. So it's just a different mindset of, you know, preservation versus conservation and management, but that grazing can really be an effective tool to help us keep our ecosystem healthy.
Thank you, John.
And I'd follow up on that. Particularly in Southern California, there's been kind of a pretty passionate debate between the idea of learning to adapt to fire through hardening the built environment and basically leaving the landscape alone. I think this is due to some some concern that fuels management will alter the natural ecology, particularly in the chaparral, and there is some truth to that. And so, that's that approach to let's fix ourselves and let Mother Nature be. That versus the approach of taking a very proactive stance and putting fuel breaks everywhere and doing tons and tons of prescribed fire and lots and lots of vegetation management projects. And I think somewhere there's a really good balance. And just, I can tell you as being a county fire marshal, I enforce part of the building code when it comes to new development and creating communities that are more where the built environment is more fire resistant. But we have so much housing stock and so much of the built environment that's old and not up to code, and there's not a lot you can do about it except watch it burn off. And I think that's why we really can't just say, hey, we're just going to put metal roofs on every building and we'll be fine. I mean, there has to be some level of fuels management for the rest of our time, because of the way we built out our state and our towns and our communities. We didn't do it consciously thinking about wildland fire, but now it's here. And so we absolutely have to do some effort towards fuels management. And I think this grazing discussion is spot on.
Thank you, Rob. Alison, the floor is yours if you'd like to use it.
I think everybody said anything that I would have said, but yeah, thanks for hosting this. And I think it is really important to keep it in mind and use all of the tools available, in combination. I don't think any one tool is the answer. Grazing by itself is not the answer. Prescribed burning by itself is not the answer. I think we all have to work together as the landscape changes and as the climate changes and as our wildfires change. We just need to keep on top of it and keep talking about what's working, and how we can best use the tools that we have.
Right. thank you. Thanks all of you. We really do appreciate your time today. So the plan now is that I just posted the link that'll take you to a regular Zoom session. For those of you who have the time and the interest and want to continue some conversation about the topics we raised today, I'm going to close this session now in just a moment, and then you can jump into the Zoom session following that link, and we will meet there and continue the conversation. Rob and John, Alison, I don't know how much time you have, but if you do have a little bit of time to pop in there and just kind of see what kind of questions come up, that'd be terrific. We'd appreciate it. And so all of you who attended, thank you for joining us. Thank you for all the questions you sent us. We're hanging on to all those, and we will try to develop some answers. We will post this session. It's being recorded, and we'll share the link with you when it's done. So with that, I will now officially close this meeting, and I will meet those of you who have an interest over on the other side.
Thanks.